Fortune magazine named it this week, Professional Identity Purgatory. The article is honest and worth reading, but it stops exactly where it gets interesting. But Carl Jung had a name for what's actually happening here. And his framework changes what this moment means entirely. So if you're between 40 and 55 and you feel like your professional identity is quietly dissolving, this is for you. Because it is not about job loss anxiety. It's about an identity erosion. So the article was written by a man who spent 30 years building a career. 9 years of that as an executive. And then an acquisition, a redundancy, and suddenly nothing. He writes honestly about being stuck in that state, between who he was and who he might become. And what he describes is not the fear of losing a job. It's something quieter, something more corrosive. It is the erosion of the self that was built over decades, around expertise, around titles, and around professional competence. And he's absolutely right. Millions of people will enter this state in the coming years. Not because AI destroys their jobs overnight, but because the professional relevance their identity rested on is quietly shifting. And that's the moment I want to step into. Not with crisis management, not with tips, just with a different perspective. So Carl Jung had a name for what many of us are facing today. And he would tell you, this is not a crisis. That's actually a threshold. Let's start with what Jung called the persona. The word comes from Latin and it meant the mask that the actors wore in Greek theater. And the mask actually signaled their role. And Jung borrowed this term for something very specific, the professional and social mask we develop to function in the world. And that's something essential in the first half of our lives. The persona is not a lie or a fake identity, as some people might interpret it. The persona is a functional adaptation. The lawyer who is the lawyer. The consultant who is the consultant. And these masks work for decades. Not only in our professional, also in our personal lives. They're generating income, they're generating status and recognition. And they gave our life a structure. Now, the problem, and Jung was very explicit about this, for example, in The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious in 1928, is that the persona is not the self. It's not who you really are. And I've seen this pattern repeatedly in my work with professionals. Usually it starts to become a problem in midlife. The people come to me at 48 or 52, having 25 or 30 years of career behind them. And at some point in our conversation, something strange happens. They can't describe who they are without immediately describing what they do, or what they used to do. So the expertise was the anchor. The expertise was actually their identity. And now, whether through AI or through an acquisition or through restructuring, or simply through the quiet feeling that what they have done for 30 years no longer feels like them, that anchor no longer holds. And it's the moment the Fortune article calls professional identity purgatory. Jung would say that's the moment the persona begins to collapse. And here's what matters. The collapse is not the end. According to Jung, it's the necessary precondition for what he called the process of individuation. But before we get there, I want to stay for a moment with what the collapse actually feels like, because that matters. There is a thread in the Jung subreddit from June 25 where someone wrote, "The day I couldn't fake it anymore, my persona collapsed. Underneath it, I didn't find peace. I found my shadow." Well, that's not a crisis report. That's a precise description of a psychological process. And I want to explain you what that means. Jung had a term for what happens when the energy invested for years in maintaining the persona reverses. Enantiodromia. And the word comes from Heraclitus. It means the turning into the opposite. So what was long the dominant force reverses. And what long provided stability becomes the source of destabilization. And that's what feels like a crisis. The exhaustion, the feeling of not knowing who you are. The discomfort in situations that used to be effortless. The loss of an anchor. But Jung's framework is very clear. The collapse is not the end. And that means ultimately the purgatory is not punishment. Let me say that again. The purgatory is not punishment. It is actually the threshold. And that's the difference between what the Fortune article describes and what Jung describes. The article, and I say this with honest respect for the author's honesty, it stays inside the suffering. He offers 3 pieces of advice. Stop filling the void with noise, hold your identity loosely, and redefine what expertise means. And the third one is the most problematic. Redefine what expertise means. That's the advice the ego gives when it's afraid. Finding new expertise means building a new persona. And that is an attempt to skip the collapse by quickly constructing a new mask. Jung would identify that as a flight from the actual work. Because the real question is not, what can I offer now? The real question is, who am I when I'm not offering anything? And I want to stay with that for a moment. Because that question, for most high-achieving professionals, is genuinely terrifying. Not because they don't have an answer. Because they have never had to find one. Because for 30 years the answer was always right there. The title, the function, the next project. I worked with a client, he was 53, 26 years in a corporate strategy. He still had the job when he came to me. He said, I walk into the room and I still know what to say. I just don't know who is saying it anymore. And that is not burnout. That is not a career problem. That is a persona that has stopped working, while the persona wearing it is still standing in the meeting. And the most disorientating part is this. There's no external event to point to. No acquisition, no redundancy, no dramatic ending. Just a quiet creeping sense that the mask has become heavier than the face beneath it. And that's the purgatory nobody writes about. Not the one that starts with a firing. The one that starts with a Tuesday morning. And the instinct, every time, is to run. Fill the calendar, start a side project, update the LinkedIn profile. Anything that feels like forward motion. Jung called that the ego's last defense. And it works. For a while. Until it doesn't. Until you're tired. And that specific exhaustion is not a warning sign. It's something else. It's the beginning of something. And this is where shadow work comes in. But let's be clear about the definition, because the term is often misunderstood or misused. The shadow, how Jung defined it, is not the evil in us. Instead, it's everything we've pushed out of consciousness because it didn't fit the persona. Everything we weren't allowed to be, weren't allowed to show, or weren't allowed to feel, because it would have threatened our mask. Now, for someone who was the expert for 30 years, what got pushed down? That's a very individual question. Maybe the doubts, the exhaustion, the feeling that the work stopped being meaningful a long time ago, the questions that couldn't be asked because they would have endangered the career, the parts of the personality that had no place in the role. And that's what shadow work in midlife career identity crisis actually means. Not as a buzzword, but as a precise description. And that's the work to be done. Because the midlife crisis is in many cases the moment the shadow becomes visible. Because our persona no longer has enough energy to suppress it. And that, and I say this from 25 years of working with Jung and 3 years of accompanying professionals through exactly these processes, that is not a misfortune. That is your invitation. I've sat across from enough people in this state to recognize the pattern. Someone arrives describing what they're going through as a crisis. And when we start looking more carefully, not at the career, but at what lies beneath, something specific happens. They start remembering things they'd forgotten, they'd buried. One of my clients, a former COO, told me in our 3rd session, I think I stopped being curious about this work a few years ago. I just got better at performing curiosity. Well, 20 years of performing curiosity? That's not a small thing to realize. That's a shadow that's been waiting for a long time. One day, the shadow confronts us with what we didn't want to see. Not because it's cruel, because it's been carrying the weight of everything the persona couldn't hold. And when the persona collapses, when the performance finally becomes unsustainable, the shadow doesn't attack. It surfaces. That's the difference. It's not an ambush, it's a return. The part of you that had no place in the role, the doubts, the unleft directions, the questions you couldn't afford to ask, they don't disappear when you suppress them. They wait. And the purgatory is the first moment of stillness long enough for them to be heard. And right, that's not comfortable. And I won't pretend it is. But it's the only way to go through it. Not around, not over, directly through it. So in my own life, in my own practice, I do this physically as well. Long runs, solo bikepacking trips, creating situations where the ego has no optimization strategy left. What remains when the mask runs out of energy, that's what I'm after. And I don't want to mention that as a proof, but because I've come to understand that the body sometimes reaches the truth faster than the mind. Now, Jung called the persona collapse not a crisis, but an enabler. The enabler of a process that he calls individuation. And the word doesn't mean finding yourself in the popular sense. It means become what you most deeply are. And it doesn't mean to let your shadow control your life, but it means the integration of the parts that were suppressed. The development of an identity that no longer rests on the persona, but on your true self. That includes everything, the persona and the shadow. And that's the difference between a persona identity and a self-identity. A persona identity depends on external confirmation, like the title, the expertise, the recognition, and the function. And when those fall away, the identity collapses. A self-identity is what remains when all of that falls away. And actually, it's not less, it's more. But it requires the work that has to be done inside the purgatory. Now, Nietzsche would add something here, and I think he and Jung are pointing at the same threshold from different directions. What Nietzsche called the last man is precisely the person who has anchored their identity entirely in social functions. The last man optimizes, adapts, survives, but never asks the harder question. What am I actually for? When the function disappears, the last man has nothing. And self-overcoming, or Selbstüberwindung, begins exactly at this point. And it is necessary. And trust me, the purgatory is not the place where you fail. It's the place where you stop lying to yourself. So the most honest sentence in the Fortune article, and I think the author knows it, is the last one. I'm still in mine. I'm tired of running. That's a good ending. Exhaustion is not defeat. Exhaustion is the moment the ego stops fighting. And that, according to Jung, is the moment individuation can begin. Now, I hope this makes sense. Let me quickly bring together what I wanted to say today. So what Fortune calls professional identity purgatory is real. And it hits midlife professionals harder than anyone else. Because 30 years of identity constructions are at stake. But the framework Jung gives us, the process of individuation, is different from what most crisis guides offer. Because it sees purgatory not as a problem. The purgatory is part of the process. The persona collapse, the feeling that expertise, title, and role no longer function as a self-concept, is not the end of identity. It is the end of an identity that was never the self. So the midlife identity crisis shadow work that becomes possible in this moment is not a repair. It's a deepening, it's a descent. An encounter with what lies beneath the mask. And if you're willing to stay here, the beginning of something more stable than anything the persona ever offered. Because your job title was never your identity. It was your hiding place. So if you're in this purgatory right now, you feel like you don't know who you are without the work, that's not a sign that something is wrong. That's a sign that you're standing at the threshold right now. And Carl Jung left us a tool for this. It's called individuation. And the first step is understanding which pattern brought you here. I've built a career archetype test. It shows you which Jungian pattern is driving your professional decisions. And which pattern is keeping you in the purgatory right now. The link is in the description. And if something of what I said landed for you, I would really like to hear from you in the comments. Because I'm also still in the process, and these conversations matter. See you next time.